4. Borderland. The next 4 hours were an exercise in containing panic. Though the van's flight began on small back roads, it soon wound onto relatively trafficked state highways, where the terrain became more open and the headlights shone further ahead through the gloom. This was, perhaps, safer than having trees so tightly flank the sides of the roadway, since any ambush or pursuit through the woods would now be more plain to see. And yet, Luther couldn't bring himself to think of it that way. At least in the thickets he'd been able to ignore the notion they were in danger. He could hang his head or tap the door with his anxious fingers and pretend, for a few tense moments, that they weren't surrounded on all sides by the unknowable. Now, with the trees often 50 or 60 yards back from the van, he was frequently reminded the world beyond the window was not a happy one. Frequently, a mob of vaguely person-shaped figures would shamble from trees or storm-battered buildings and make a loping pursuit of the van as it sped past. They were oblong and asymmetrical things, as the hunters scouring the suburban backyard had been, and they moved with a speed and agility which would have been deadly had they been fleeing on foot. The worst of these was a sighting Luther made about an hour into the drive, when he saw a group of haggard people in filthy clothing burst from the parking lot of an apartment complex in the dark with hands waving and voices raised in desperate fear. They clearly wanted the driver to stop, and yet Oarem and Traven up front made no sign that they'd noticed them. As the van sped by and the headlights left the trailing survivors in shadow, Luther caught the flurry of motion as a misshapen hunting pack emerged from the same apartment complex and closed in with the stranded stragglers on the roadside. Though their screams were too distant for Luther to hear them, that didn't mean his imagination didn't create equally horrible noises to score the slaughter he knew must be playing out behind them in the blackness while they fled. Cars left dark and derelict along the roadside, perhaps abandoned when the storm had overtaken them and made visibility difficult, had to be swerved past as they loomed forth from the downpour. Though the rainfall was not quite so dense now as it had been early on, it was still fierce, and the soft red gleam of inactive brake lights were poor security indeed. The oily residue deposited by the spray left the windows and windshield slick and streaked with grime, further throttling their vision. More than a few sharp turns and banks onto the bumpy shoulder of the road nearly ended in crashes. Yet, slowing down was not an option. The frequency with which awful shapes lurched and leapt from the dark to rake at the van with outstretched claws was too much. The woods and towns past which they drove were alive with the braying song of a million mad beasts, and the death that terrible music promised was too much to ignore. Occasionally, other headlights flared out of the dark and passed them down the highway, always headed eastward, in the other direction. Every lonely vehicle's passage left Luther more and more certain they were driving into the jaws of something from which there would be no escape. Though the westbound cars didn't have much better chances than they did, at least the occupants felt they were headed away from the danger. Perhaps more terrible than the animalistic shrieking or the loping hunting packs or the writhing shapes of stranger beasts in the murk outside were the things that were occasionally glimpsed in the dull flashes of lightning which struggled to illuminate the black clouds of the night sky overhead. If Luther was particularly unfortunate, he'd find himself looking through the window at the moment of the flash. Several times he spotted vast, confusing shapes rising up to break distant horizons, dwarfing buildings and communications towers in the rolling hills of the countryside. They were mere silhouettes at that distance, of course, as so many of the things glimpsed through the storm had been. And yet those silhouettes moved and walked and bent like mountains strolling the land. Some moved on vast, stilted legs, and others seemed to slide like slugs among the ruins of the world they feasted upon. It was a glimpse of one of these giants that drove Luther to scrunch shut his eyes and wait in silent blindness through the rest of the ride. As he glimpsed it in the sudden flash of the storm's muted heat lightning, he could not help but discern a vast, horned head as it rotated to look back in his direction, tracing, he knew, a distant set of lonely headlights carving their way across a darkened landscape. None of these giants ever pursued them directly, as the hunting packs had done. Then again, perhaps that was only because they'd all been far away. Perhaps they'd had better targets available to them. Whatever the case might be, the giants were just as wrong as the smaller beasts which haunted and hunted the trees and shattered houses. They were all outsiders, things with no place walking the world they walked, or seeing the sights they saw. It wouldn't do to dwell on those outsiders now, trapped in the speeding van as it whipped through the center of their newly conquered domain. Hours passed, and at length the night's drive ended long past midnight, if the van's inbuilt clock was to be trusted. Only with the approach of dawn threatening them did Oarem and Traven agree to find a spot to bed down. They were, as it turned out, about 10 miles west of Louisville, Kentucky. They'd carved across Illinois and most of Indiana in the darkness, and the world around them had grown calm. This was, Oarem said, because most of the people here had already been consumed, and the greater portion of the dreamer's servants were moving westward to seek the choicest morsels. There were likely hangers-on in Louisville, though, populous as it was, so it would be best to break here and pass through with cautious speed tomorrow morning. Their gas was dangerously low. Moreover, they'd have to abandon the car soon. The military had, Traven claimed, blown the bridges across the Ohio River before withdrawing into the west. They'd need to sneak through the area and find another ride after they'd gotten some rest and crossed the river into Kentucky, and to risk stopping at all, they would need a place to hide. Traven had many such potential hiding places picked out, and Morgan pitched in with his own options from the back row after they'd worked out exactly where they were on the maps they carried. Morgan, suggesting a long-abandoned set of distribution warehouses near Georgetown, Indiana, ended up winning out. Oarem said this would be their safest bet, since there had likely been no one present when the storms had swept in. Thus, the hunting packs and other beasts enthralled to the dreamer would have little motivation to linger there. They'd mostly be long gone in search of greener pastures to ravage, leaving their group space and silence to bed down and hide through the dull light of the day. The van wound through 2 or 3 miles of industrial park to reach the place. Most of it was aged, and the majority of the tottering factories and shipping facilities had been shuttered long ago. Amplifying the stifling somberness of the decaying industrial sector was the silence, for the rain had slowed to a steady patter, and the cries and bleats of alien voices in the dark were nowhere to be heard. Sirens, shrieks, and gunshots, which had occasionally flared up as they roared past one town or another, were absent. Luther supposed he should find this heartening. After all, if there was nothing to make noises, there was nothing to find them while they rested. Still, he couldn't convince himself the quiet was a good thing. The plants are already starting to warp under the influence of the dreamer's blood, Morgan commented from the rear. Is the area safe? Luther hadn't even thought to look closely upon the trees and shrubs themselves since beginning to look from the windows again. The dark scrub pines and towering weeds which choked old fence lines and ate crumbling walls in the industrial park had been the least of his worries. He'd been scanning for things which might lurk or creep behind them. Now, focusing in on the vegetation, he suddenly knew what had felt so wrong. He knew why no insects chirped in the warm, muggy air outside, and no calm had found him since they came into the forest of derelict buildings. He knew why the place had seemed so hostile. Overgrown is how he'd have dismissed them at first. Now, beneath the van's fleeting headlights, they seemed more than overgrown. The foliage was thick and lush, far thicker than any summer growth could warrant, and the hues of the leaves and vines were all wrong. They were dark and waxen, stiff with a gluttonous, lifeless quality Luther wouldn't have believed possible for plants that weren't plastic. And yet, lifeless as they looked, they seemed to sway and ripple in the windless drizzle. "We have a while yet before they are fully transformed," Oarem answered. "When the sky clears, that's when we'll know we're under the Dreamer's influence. We can't know where the edge of that influence is, but I'd be surprised if it's crept west past Lexington yet. The mountain will make the Dreamer struggle for every inch of ground." Traven parked the vehicle in a stand of thick grass which had eaten a gravel pull-off hole. The blades twisted and bobbed as the group offloaded their gear, took up their stored fuel, and siphoned the last of the slim tank from the van into the cans. Luther found himself watching it warily as the others covered the van in foliage they ripped up from the roadside. While he shied away from the growth, they seemed to shrug off the strange liveliness it displayed, and cut through it with knives to bury their ride. Only when the van was nearly invisible to the tangle did Morgan take the lead and show them along a winding route he'd picked out from satellite images before the trip east had begun. The path was a jungle now, and the soupy black mud which had built up after days of putrid downpour made it slow going, but eventually they stumbled their way to a vast garage door in the dark. It stood half open, a yawning, rusty maw which creaked and groaned with age. Oarem was the first in, rifle leading, and the others followed with guns raised and ready. Alien as the revolver still felt in his hand, Luther felt a little less naked creeping through the shadows with it drawn. The dark within gradually formed itself into a towering storage or sorting space as their eyes adjusted. It was floored in concrete, and the rusted roof dripped into stagnant puddles here and there upon the ground, lending the place the damp air of a natural cavern. Rickety walkways of corroded metal hung from the ceiling overhead, groaning as their weight strained against aged bolts and joints. Much as the intrepid group tried to stifle their voices and footsteps, every noise they raised echoed fiercely in the blackness. Submerging all this in the clamor of white noise was the patter of rain against the old roof, which was fortunately amplified by the same vaulted ceilings that carried the voices of the intruders. Luther tried for some time to determine what the purpose of the vast building had been as they patrolled the space, to grasp what exactly had been stored or sorted here. There were 2 gigantic mounds of what looked to be metal shavings beneath the walkways on either side of the room, and there was a battered old claw bucket hanging from rigging overhead, a massive parody of an arcade crane game. There were also several gaps in the concrete floor where machinery or sorting funnels had been ripped up and hauled away. He supposed it was part of a foundry or steel mill, but he didn't know enough about metalwork or manufacture to know anything for certain. Still, wondering about the mundane purpose of this sidelined structure in a forgotten part of a rotting city distracted him from thoughts of the impossible things which awaited him beyond the warehouse's looming doors. Oarem eventually settled them up on the walkways, where they spread several bedrolls and ate a modest meal from cold cans. There were doors set into the walls up here, and passing through them brought one out onto mirrored walkways which spanned the spaces between adjacent warehouses. Thus, Oarem figured the walkways served 2 purposes. They gave them a sweeping vantage point from which to watch the warehouse floor, and offered them an escape hatch should they need to flee on short notice. Uncomfortable as the metal mesh of the walkways was, Luther doubted he'd get much rest. The creaking of the old metal beneath him every time he shifted his weight seemed to assure him of that. Besides, the tumult outside and the racing of his troubled mind wouldn't allow such luxuries. So it was that when Oarem offered to take the first watch and asked for a volunteer to join him, Luther rose and strode down the walkway in his brother's wake. They moved out to the central walkway that bridged the gap between the two sides of the warehouse, and Oarem directed Luther to sit back to back with him, that they might watch both entrances at once. Before they got settled in, Oarem passed off an old hunting rifle to Luther, showing him the function of the bolt and demonstrating the use of the sights. Then both sat down opposite each other, the rain drumming at a constant rhythm as the sky faintly brightened with the cloud-strangled dawn outside. "I haven't had the occasion to tell you," Oarem said in hushed tones, "but we're all carrying silver rounds. They seem to be better able to injure things the dreamer has corrupted. It still isn't a sure thing, but it's better to have it. The rifle is loaded with silver. You should keep it. Use it when the enemy isn't entirely human. Save your revolver for looters or soldiers." "Thanks for the heads up," Luther said. The old sarcasm was there, not lost on Oarem, despite the intervening years. "We've been with you the whole time," Oarem said. "If we'd been attacked, you would have had silver shot whether you were carrying it or not." Luther had to grant him that. "Besides, unless you've been hunting or sport shooting up in Chicago, you're probably a pretty lousy shot," Oarem told him. "I would let you shoot a while if we could afford to make the noise. As it is, it's better to stay quiet." They sat in silence for a long moment. Luther was trying to find the words he needed to ask what was happening, to look for answers Oarem hadn't had the time or patience to give before. He eventually settled on a roundabout approach, one which felt less direct and dangerous to him. "Why silver?" "I can't say," Oarem replied. "It's been handed down that it works, and it does. Maybe it has something to do with silver's mythical importance as a lunar metal. The enemy came down from among the stars, if legends are to be believed. Perhaps something from beyond can only be killed by something else from beyond." Another silence, this one less lengthy. "What does it want? This dreamer, you've called it?" It was Oarem's turn to think. Luther was left in thought of his own for half a minute, trying to imagine the look on his brother's unseen face as he weighed what he should say. "It's homesick," Oarem said at last. "It did not come here by choice. The enemy came down in exile. It slept for a long time, dreaming of home. It can't go back, though, not yet. So it seeks to replicate the world it remembers here. It will use the material it has to work with. It will bend the life of our world to better resemble what it remembers of home." Silence fell again. Luther was summoning up more questions when Oarem spoke, having marshaled his thoughts. "That's what most of the things in the storm are. They are people, they are animals and plants. Life the dreamer has won over to its service, and changed to suit his vision. The black ichor in the rain is its blood, or that's what it's called at least. They change when they drink it, just as the plants outside are changing. So it's an infection of some kind, spread by this blood?" "I suppose it is, in a sense," Oarem conceded, "but the blood only opens one's thoughts to the dreamer. Anything that happens afterwards is voluntary. You must submit to be changed." Luther considered that. Try as he might, he could not square that away with the lopsided, misshapen things which had haunted the outskirts of St. Louis. Though that chaos seemed an age ago now from where they sat hundreds of miles east, it had been mere hours ago, and the image of those twisted organisms writhing and hunting in the murk was fresh. Awful as the sight had been, it was engraved in Luther's mind, vivid as if the things had been glimpsed minutes ago just outside the warehouse. Even summoning up those cruel shapes to the forefront of his thoughts revolted him. How would anything submit to that? Oarem sighed. Luther couldn't shake the feeling Oarem had anticipated each question, and yet this one seemed to be the one his brother had dreaded most. He couldn't see the lean man's dark expression, but he heard the dire tone of it well enough when at last Oarem spoke. "There's a reason why certain people stow away money and time to escape from their day-to-day lives by base jumping or mountain climbing. Why an executive might decide to run marathons and train martial arts in his sorely limited spare time," Oarem began, the words coming slow. "There's a reason why some soldiers returned from deployment miss it. They'll say they miss the camaraderie and the feeling of interconnection they had with the people they served with under such stressful conditions, and that's partially true. But they also miss the intensity of it." Oarem stopped a moment to gather his thoughts, and Luther didn't interrupt. "Modernity is comfortable. A man can live his entire life within the system we've built and never go without warm baths and warmer meals. He can survive maladies and deformities that would have killed him had he been left to his own devices without modern medicine to heal him. He can slide through his whole existence driving, sitting, and flying without ever knowing the strength of which his body is capable. He can walk, but he is never forced to run. Hardship will find him, true, but it will always be the hardship of loss," Oarem continued. "He will suffer through long work hours to gain a trinket he wants and lose time. He will suffer a breakup and lose love. He'll experience the death of a friend and lose companionship, but he will never lose comfort. Not entirely. Not so long as he follows the rules of the world to which he was born. As long as he obeys his betters, shows up on time, and pays his dues to the distant state, he will be left to enjoy the soft glow of his television from his bed each night. He will be allowed enough funds to escape into a game every weekend, and imagine he is a character more powerful than he is. He will not freeze in his home. Even the working poor, in our lands at least, have more access to escape from the losses they suffer day to day than those of any age prior to our own, and they are mostly happy to bend the knee and live by the rule of others to be given that escape." "You're saying comfort corrupts?" "I'm saying comfort, especially escape, is a drug," Oarem replied. "Like most, it isn't necessarily an inherent evil. Even a wild wolf basks in the sun on a chill day and enjoys the warmth, just as a Mongol nomad probably unwinds with his family by the hot coals within his tent after a brutal day herding on the steppe. It's only in excess that it becomes deadly. As it stands, most in our civilization are addicts in an opium den from which they can't escape. That's why a soldier, if he's particularly vital, might miss a war zone, even if he was desperate to leave the whole time he was stuck there. It's why a bored traveler might save and train for years to attempt the summit of Everest, even though they know they might die in the attempt. There's something real there at the extreme edge of human experience. The little social niceties and obligations and observations that have to be made at work or back home are stripped away. All that's left is you and the people alongside you, and the threat you have to overcome. Even if that threat is relatively small, say with skydiving, the participant still feels danger, and thus overcoming is ecstasy for them. It is a reminder that they are alive, a reminder that they are capable of struggling and winning that struggle. It shows them they are still able to run. I think, given all my options, I'd have preferred not to be forced to run." "Most would agree," Oarem said. Luther detected no scorn in that. Maybe sadness, but no scorn. "Most, even given a taste of struggle, are bred to the new world," Oarem went on. "They are creatures of comfort. They are not at all upset by the lack of freedom or agency. They are quite happy to play by the rules and enjoy what's been given to them. I might not feel the same, but that's not really the point. Those aren't the people the dreamer speaks to. Those aren't the people it wants. Low thunder rolled overhead. Luther looked up and realized the milky, almost sickly glow beyond the tiny gaps in the roof had grown stronger. "It has an easier time with beasts and plants, of course," Oarem said. "But sickly as humankind has become, there are still more than a few who will hear its call and answer it." Luther brooded on that a while, but the whole of the talk had dredged up more questions from the depths of his mind than it had answers. Of these, the most salient gnawed the deepest, and he could not help but ask it in the awful half-light of the dim morning in that dingy warehouse. "You agree with the assessment," Luther said. "The dreamers, I mean. Our father did too. Never as openly, but I remember as well as you do the way he talked. I suspect he shared a great deal more with you. You were always closer to him. But why stop the dreamer at all if you feel the same?" "Because the dreamer's end goal is not mine," Oarem said. "We, humanity I mean, are merely a tool to the dreamer. It does not want to return our world and the things in it to some harsher, more real age. It merely wishes to go home. Since it cannot, it will bring home here. It will use us to burn down what we've built, and in the process, forge us into things which better fit the image of the Deadlands." "Deadlands?" "It's the place to which the dreamer pulls its followers. The place it will replicate here if it wins. Deadlands is the name my order has given it. It is the mirrored image of wherever it came from. We'll see it for ourselves before long. The light outside means the storm holding back the tide is breaking here. By the time we leave this warehouse, the world beyond these walls will be very different than the one we know." Again silence fell, and this time Oarem seemed to have finished talking. For a full 20 minutes they sat like that, back to back and brooding. Then Luther spoke, mustering one last question amidst the pattering clatter upon the roof. "The call of the mountain is what Dad used to call it," Luther said. "Your order. What do you serve?" Oarem thought a while before answering. "We serve the earth, the mountain. That's all you need to know." Luther heard Oarem turn behind him, the leather of his old coat creaking with the motion. Luther followed suit, and they looked over their shoulders at each other in the gloom for a long time, Oarem's eyes almost black in the low light. His expression was not haughty, distant, or agitated, though. It was merely tired. "I promise to tell you more, if we survive this." Luther nodded. "Deal." The two turned back toward their respective doors and resumed their vigil, but the watch lasted only a minute before Oarem spoke again. "You should go sleep," he said. "We will reach the mouth sometime tonight, assuming everything goes according to plan. This is the last chance we'll have to rest before we get there." Luther almost protested. He almost asked what this mouth they kept referencing was. But the weight of the day had crashed down upon him in those last few moments, and despite the nervous tension he felt, his eyes struggled to remain open. He rose, the metal creaking as he went. "You sure you don't need a little sleep yourself?" "I can't," Oarem answered, shifting around on the walkway so he could more easily glance back and forth between the two entryways along the ground floor. He never looked up, and Luther never pushed it by asking further. He simply crossed to the platform where the others had bedded down, laid out the rifle Oarem had given him beside his bedroll, and slipped quickly into sleep.